Israel grabbed, in 1967, at the end of 1967, Israel grabbed the Golan Heights from Syria,
the Sinai Desert,
the Sinai from Egypt, the Gaza Strip, and the
West Bank.
West Bank. Right.
Wow.
Yes. Fundamentally changing the map. So when we talk about a withdrawal to the borders of 1967 and a two-state solution, that's what we mean.
Grab is the word.
Right, well, a withdrawal to the 67. Yes, it was a grab, it was a land grab. The people that live there refer to it as an occupation, not surprisingly. So, needless to say, from between 1967 and the next sort of major conflict between the Israelis and their neighbors, we get a very pivotal person. Anwar Sadat, he dies, and his place is taken by, or I'm sorry, Nasser dies, and his place is taken by a man named Anwar Sadat, who I suspect many of us recognize his name. And he came to power in Egypt not just with the death of Nasser, but with the countries that surround Israel adopting what was called the three no's: no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation. So we're not going to negotiate with you. We're not going to recognize Israel because of what you've done, which I'm sure this is not helpful. And King Hussein of Jordan is trying to, play the mediator in all of this, because the Hashemite dynasty in Jordan, the Hashemites are the custodians of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Golden Dome. So Anwar Sadat, interestingly enough, one of 13 children. So that's absolutely fantastic. And I know, right? 13 children. Can you imagine? His mother's a saint. And I could barely raise one. Yeah. So, and he starts to have a very different perspective on how to deal with Israel. And this is going to evolve in the wake of the 1973 war. Pox on both your houses. Yes. And so in 1970, interestingly enough, Anwar Sadat, in an interview with the New York Times, said the following quote, that if Israel returned the Sinai, he was ready to recognize the rights of Israel as an independent state based on 1967. So pre-1967 borders. He was willing to do that. And this, you can only imagine, didn't exactly make him the most popular person in the region, but he thought that he would start there. That in exchange for the returning of the Sinai, we'll recognize Israel and we'll negotiate. So we'll step back from those three no's. So this plan gets presented to the then Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, not known for her desire to negotiate with her neighbors. A tough woman. I think probably, if you've seen the film Munich, she was the prime minister at the time of the assassination, the killing of all the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972, and she got some of her elite forces and took out everybody that was involved, and she led that. So anyway, again, not known for her. She does not mess around, this woman. Yeah.
Is Golda Meir is from Wisconsin?
She went to school in Wisconsin.
She taught school in Wisconsin.
She did.
And so that's her background and her history as United States, and yet she rose to this prominent.
But she was not born in the U.S.
She wasn't.
No. the first prime minister. No, I take that back. She was. Yeah, the prime minister after her was the first one born in Palestine. Yes, she was born in the States to Jewish parents, Holocaust survivors.
So that's pretty amazing.
Oh yeah.
Rise to power.
Oh yeah. Oh no. No. I'm not critical. I'm just saying she's
Yeah.
just tough. And so she decided, no, we're not going to do that. And so Anwar Sadat's like, well, okay, fine. You're not going to do this. And so we're going to have to try to take the Sinai back by force. And that's what happened in 1973. The Yom Kippur War, 1973, was, interestingly enough, really successful in getting back the Sinai. Not only did Israel, there's the other thing I want to say about that Anwar Sadat did everything in his power to telegraph his plans of what he planned to do in getting back the Sinai. He led troop maneuvers. He started amassing troops on the border. He did everything in his power to say, we are coming for this strip of land. And much like what happened in on October 7th, the Israelis what? They ignored it. Said no. They ignored that this was even a possibility. So he sends away even the Soviets start to move their advisors and their families out. There's military equipment coming in from Damascus. There are photographs. There are aerial photographs of Egyptian and Syrian tanks and infantry and surface-to-air missiles amassed on the Sinai border. This is a pretty strong sign that something is gonna happen. And so Golda Meir finally, like, oh my God, she convenes a war council and she puts a man named Moshe Dayan, you can recognize him, he's always wearing a patch, in charge of saying, okay, maybe we have to deal with this. Egypt attacks on Yom Kippur, which does anybody know what Yom Kippur is?
Jewish Day of
It's
Atonement.
the Jewish Day of Atonement. As my friends that are Jewish say, Jeanette, you Catholics, you just have to go to confession all the time. And we have one day, we just get it over with. And we're good for another year. Like, that's so funny. So at any rate, the Henry Kissinger is trying to prevent war. At any rate, two important things happen. One is Egypt will ultimately get back to Sinai. But even more importantly, it was a reminder to the Israeli Defense Force that we are not beyond attack, that we can lose. We are not necessarily the only powerful military in the region. And this changes the calculus of how at least Egypt and Israel, decide to deal with each other. And so that once the heavy fighting ended on the 28th of October, 1973, talks start, and Henry Kissinger kind of negotiated this plan that initially the UN would take over Israeli checkpoints, non-military supplies would be allowed into the Sinai, and that there would be an exchange of prisoners. All of this should sound uber familiar to us, right? And that in UN Resolution 344, calling for a just and durable peace, was signed between the two countries in 1974. Israel withdrew from the entire Sinai, gave up any hope of reaching the Suez Canal, and this is the first example of land for peace. The first example of an exchange of land for peace. And it's held. It has held since 1974, which is, I think, really pretty remarkable. Yeah. Anwar Sadat also came to a very important conclusion. And that was that this battle was not going, this conflict, this situation between he and his neighbors was not going to be won on the battlefield. And he makes what will turn out to be a promise that will end his life. Yeah. Golda Meir resigns as a result of what happened. Yitzhak Rabin becomes prime minister. And then, of course, we get the Camp David Accords. Jimmy Carter, which I have a great picture of it, incidentally. I have a great picture of this. There he is. There's the himself. No, I wonder if this. I'm just going to try this really fast. Slideshow, yes. I have a love-hate relationship with my touchpad. Mostly hate.
Jimmy Carter was,
Yeah, Jimmy Carter.
was pretty big. I don't know.
He was huge, and let's try this. Let's see if it just won't do anything. Oh! Our pictures. Let's see if it'll show this. Okay, so Jimmy Carter, I have this great picture of Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin actually hugging each other. I know, you can sort of see it there. You can see the little screen.
We believe you.
You have to believe me. It's really there. And so anyway, and that Anwar Sadat also makes a very important promise, that he will go anywhere and meet with anybody to try to ensure that the peace holds. So what he does, he goes to Jerusalem. He addresses the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, and he meets with both the prime minister and high-ranking officials in Jerusalem, which is a tacit acknowledgement of what?
It's Israel's existence.
That the capital of Israel is
Yeah,
Jerusalem. Yes. Which it's not supposed to be, as we know, right? It was supposed to be in the UN agreement. It was an international city along with Bethlehem. So he goes there. He addresses the Knesset. He makes a vow that Egypt will not attack Israel, that it recognizes Israel's right to exist. Tragically, in 1981, he is assassinated by a young university student in Cairo. So one of his own people. He is assassinated. And I would argue that with him died perhaps one of the last true statesmen in the region. Yeah. So, and interestingly enough, in a sort of poignant turn of events, that he was visited, that the event at which he was assassinated was commemorating Egypt's victory in gaining back the Sinai. So from 1977, 87, in that 10-year period, things are good with Egypt and Israel, but not really good anywhere else. Because, of course, the occupied territories are still occupied except for the Sinai. And what happens in 1987 is the first Intifada. It's a series of uprisings, this is very important, in territory occupied by Israel after 1967. So, and in particular, in the West Bank and Gaza. A series of initially peaceful uprisings to try to gain these territories back. Also, 1982, Israel invades Lebanon, which we're seeing the fruits of that, kind of right now. And in Israel, the country is split. How do we deal with the Intifada? How do we deal with these uprisings? How do we manage this problem? The Labor Party wanted to make a territorial compromise. And their argument was, of course, that a territorial compromise worked for who? Worked for Egypt. It worked. The Likud Party, more conservative, currently the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, was adamantly opposed to giving back anything. And yet, the Knesset is a very strange place. Nobody can really, there are so many of these small parties in Israel that it's very hard to get a definitive majority. So they end up making these very strange alliances with these smaller parties to gain a majority. So what happened was that in this instance, Labor and Likud were forced to join or form a unity government. So there are these two competing factions of how do we deal with the West Bank and Gaza, and yet people are miserable, people are unhappy, they are occupied, right? So while they're sort of fighting it out in Jerusalem, in the meantime, the situation with the Palestinians is becoming increasingly untenable. And throughout the 1980s, this is exacerbated by administrative detention. Administrative detention by people is a fancy term for we can hold you without charges indefinitely. Deporting suspected activists. Palestinians were forced to carry ID cards, pay special taxes, and go through security checks to get out of the West Bank and Gaza. It just sounds terribly, terribly familiar. And so, into this mix, you get these uprisings led by, of course, the PLO and Yasser Arafat. And they developed what they called a 14-point program. Am I going to tell you all 14? No, I am not. But I am going to tell you the most important ones. The stoppage of settlement building.
Most important one.
And you're right, that is the single most important one, is to stop the building of settlements. To cancel special taxes and restrictions that applied to Palestinians, and recognize a Palestinian state led by the PLO. At the time, the head of who was Yasser Arafat. Interestingly enough, one of his closest confidants, a woman named Hanan Ashrawi, Palestinian Christian.
Oh.
Yeah, Palestinian Christian, educated here in the United States. Quite a remarkable woman. She's still alive. She's very active on X, which used to be Twitter. Yes, she is. She is often there talking about any number of things. And as the Intifada becomes increasingly violent, there's another attempt at peace. Let me just give you the death toll. In the end, by the end of the Intifada, 1,000 Palestinians were dead, 6 Israelis were dead, 37,000 Arabs were injured, and between 35,000 and 40,000 Palestinians were arrested.
Wow. Where'd they put them?
Oh my God. They have prisons, I know because I've been there, to the prisons. They dot the landscape. They're kind of all over. And you can't really tell they're there, and you can't take pictures of them when you're there. But they're all over the place. Some on the occupied territory. I think the couple that we visited were right on the Jordanian border.
The care must be inadequate.
Well, everything is inadequate. And yet, oh Lord, the Israelis will tell you, no, it's fine. They have enough to eat, and they have lawyers. Yeah, they have lawyers. And how often do the lawyers get in? Well, it's kind of another story. And they're there, most of them without charge. Some of them have been there since the first Intifada, without charges. This does not bring you goodwill and better friendships, people. So what happens is because again, let's try to remember back to presidents, since time immemorial, well, not time immemorial, but, every 4 years we get a president that I'm going to be the one to deliver peace in the Middle East, right? Some are more successful than others. And the first of these attempts that could have been successful, and I really want to stress that, could have been successful, were the Oslo Peace Accords in the early 1990s. So in advance of meeting in Oslo, which you can only imagine, all these people from, the Middle East, and they're going to go to Oslo, where it's really cold. I mean, we'll say anything. We will do anything. We will just get us out of here. They start with a series of preemptive meetings in, interestingly enough, Moscow and Washington, D.C. I know, so people there's all this shuttle diplomacy, and people are going back and forth between D.C. and Moscow. And George Bush, who was the president at the time, decided that his part, or one of the most important parts that the United States could play, was to demand the cessation of settlement building. And he did that. He told Israel, A, to stop building settlements, and B, that if they didn't stop, he would withhold financial assistance. Go George Bush!
It was a lot of money, right, the financial assistance?
Oh, billions.
But
Billions, absolutely. They have technology we don't have, and we've paid for it. You think I'm kidding? I'm super serious. I'm sure I told you this in one of my talks, that my people, the Italians, when the Olympics were there in 2006, when they were in Torino, my people, are you kidding? We want to feed you and do all these things, but we do not do security very well. And so we hired the Mossad.
Oh.
The Italians hired the Mossad to handle their security situation. Let me tell you, it's probably the safest Olympics anywhere, because, you just don't mess with these people. And, oh yeah, they came in, they said, well, this needs to change, and you need to do that, and honest to criminy, are you just going to let anybody get on the subway? The Italians are like, yeah, it's going to be fine. Because that's kind of who we are. Yeah. And so Israel reluctantly comes to, well, let me tell you what was on the table. One of the things on the table was $10 billion loan guarantee. That's the figure, $10 billion loan guarantee. And it strained relations because the prime minister at the time in Israel, Shamir, said, I don't care. Cancel the loans. We're not gonna play ball. And then it turns out they needed that money. So in 1993, Israel and the PLO, Yasser Arafat, looking very cool, they show up, and the goal of Oslo 1, the foundations for Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And Israel is like, okay, we don't want continued violence. So here's what they agreed. Mutual recognition between Israel and the Palestinians. So Israel recognizes the Palestinian state, or the potential for a Palestinian state, and the PLO and the Palestinians recognize Israel's right to exist as a non-negotiable. Those are just, we accept that both people deserve a state of their own. Not only did the PLO recognize Israel's right to exist, but Yasser Arafat renounced violence and terrorism. For a man who started his life as a terrorist, this was a really big deal. A really big deal. It's like, no, we're not going to use violence and terror to get what we want. In exchange, the Palestinian Authority was put on a 5-year plan to deal with the occupied territories, to deal with the people that live there and to figure out what this new state, how it's going to look. Israel withdrew its troops from Gaza and the West Bank, and the West Bank city of Jericho. Not the entire West Bank, but the city of Jericho, one of the oldest cities in history. If you've ever been there, it's amazing. And the idea with Oslo I was that it would lead to the creation of a Palestinian state, even though there was no, and here's where it breaks down for me at least. There was no specific mention of a state. Because of course there is land involved. And Oslo kept getting pushed down the road far past that 5-year plan. People didn't know how to deal with East Jerusalem. They didn't know how to deal with the settlements. How do we deal with the Palestinian refugees in places like Jordan and Syria and Lebanon? And of course, what does sovereignty look like? Because Israel does not want the Palestinians to have a military. And that's a real sticking point, because you can't be a nation if you cannot conduct your own military. So this is an ongoing sort of problems. In the wake of Oslo, the Prime Minister Rabin at the time ended a freeze on construction, confiscated 20,000 acres of land in the West Bank and Gaza, and of course, in this situation, you have the rise of Hamas, and Hamas rejected the Oslo peace process entirely because they felt that the Israelis had not negotiated in good faith. Questions? I'm gonna have questions for you at the end.
When 20,000 acres are confiscated,
Yeah.
there's probably people on that land. Do they have any kind of recourse or option? Do they stay there? Do they get out? Do they sign up with one side or the other
Well, oh yeah, they do. They sign up with the side that
that owns the land or took it?
took it. They move. What they do is they'll go in, and the favorite target is olive trees. That is the single most important, symbolically important, well, also economically important item. And they will target these olive trees, and they'll uproot them and it's just horrible when this happens, because there are olive trees in that region that are 2,000 years old.
Oh.
And they're still producing. And they'll go in and every family has an olive tree. At least, I mean, probably more than that, right? Every family's got one, or 2, or 5, or 17 million. My friends, they have a bunch of them, and they make their own olive oil and sell it. So it's it's something that they do, it's one of the things they produce on the farm. And so they go in, they confiscate the land, pull up the olive trees, and then bring in settlers to settle it.
Oh.
Bring in Jewish settlers to settle the land, and the Palestinians are pushed out. Yeah, that's what happens. Yeah.
So one of the arguments even today is there never really was a Palestinian state, right? It was just land, forever and ever, way back when.
Right. That's the Zionist argument.
Right.
Correct. Which is interesting because there are Palestinian Jews, and they're not on board with most of this, right? It's really the descendants of the European community that is where the tension lies. They were all Palestinians before 1948. God did make that promise to both Ishmael and Isaac. I will make of you a great nation. There is that. We tend to get stuck. But there is that, So Yitzhak Rabin is not happy with the ongoing violence, and so he decides that maybe he needs to make more of an effort to negotiate with the PLO in the sort of the breakdown, if you will, of the Oslo Accords. He does that, and he himself, of course, is also assassinated. He is assassinated in 1995 at a rally in Tel Aviv by a student at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So again, the death of somebody who was willing at least to try. And I think and if you were to ask people in the fallout from the fact that Oslo didn't work well, even though it was supposed to, one of the pivotal events that they will tell you, and this is a story that I have heard many times, is so important. In 1994, a Israeli settler activist named Baruch Goldstein used an automatic weapon on Palestinians praying at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, the tomb of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, all the folks. They're all buried there. You see I showed you a picture of their tombs. They're all buried there. He went in with an automatic weapon into the mosque during Friday prayer, during the Juma prayer, and killed 29 people.
Oh dear.
He was ultimately killed, and they will cite this as, and he shouldn't have been there in the first place, because Hebron is in the West Bank. So what you see when you go to Hebron, it's really kind of sad. If you go to Hebron and if you walk the old city, which is fabulous, the Palestinians live here, and then up above there are settlers, Israeli settlers, and they've had to put up netting because the settlers who live on top throw their garbage down onto the people in the street.
Not goodwill.
This is not goodwill. Right? And then people, as you know, my friend likes to say, and then, Jeanette, the Palestinians respond with violence, which that doesn't help either, right? So it's just this sort of cycle. So the Oslo Accords completely unravel, and President Clinton in 1998, now keep in mind, 1998, Bill Clinton helped negotiate, or actually his envoy, George Mitchell, helped negotiate a really important peace. And what was that?
Ireland.
Yes, it was. It was the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland that ended mostly the conflict between the British and the Protestants and the Catholics. So Bill Clinton is like, okay, I'm good. I got this, man. I know how to I can do peace. So he invites Benjamin Netanyahu and Yasser Arafat, because now Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister in Israel, the first time, to Wye River in Maryland. So the Wye River Accords. And Netanyahu and Arafat signed what was called the Wye Accords, that really in many ways was an attempt to breathe new life into Oslo. But Benjamin Netanyahu, in this particular iteration of himself, agreed to exchange land for peace and security. And I have a picture of these two men shaking hands. Benjamin Netanyahu and Yasser Arafat shaking hands. Yes, the Benjamin Netanyahu that we all know and love today. He was not always like this. He was not always like this. I know. Right? So, he's out. Benjamin Netanyahu, he's out, and it leads to a second uprising and the election of a man named Ariel Sharon. Perhaps here's Ariel Sharon. He was tough. In 2000, he led a security force of 1,000 people up to the Temple Mount, that's close to Jews that live in Jerusalem or live in Palestine. And he was not supposed to be up there, leading to a massive outrage. He wanted to show that Jews could visit the Temple Mount, which was, of course, a massive affront to the Muslims who lived there, keeping in mind that they all remember what happened in Hebron, right? I mean, this is in the back of people's minds. It led to an incident of stone throwing in which 18 Palestinians were killed. Yeah. And you just sort of got this perpetual cycle of violence. How am I doing? Oh yeah, okay. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So how do we get to today? How did we get from 2 intifadas and the continual sort of building of settlements, and that's kind of where I want to end today before we get to some questions, and I have the Hail Mary in Arabic, and I'm going to ask you to say it with me. I think the tragedy of what happened were the unresolved conflict of the early 2000s. The collapse of Oslo before that, the collapse of Wye River, and an increasing hardening of people's positions. And the interesting thing is that you get, when situations like this go unresolved, I guess, and nobody is willing to say we need to put a stop to this. And I want to also say that the death of Yasser Arafat was very bad for peace, because the current leader of the Palestinians, they're not the statesman that he was. They did not have the change of heart. Well, Mahmoud Abbas wants peace, but they're not the statesman that he was. My students in my Core 110 class read a book called I Shall Not Hate. And it's about a doctor, a Palestinian doctor in Gaza. And in the early 80s, he lost 3 of his daughters and a niece when an Israeli tank leveled their apartment building. And he talks in this journey, he talks about how do you get from this horrific event to saying, I won't hate. And he makes a very profound statement about halfway through the book. He said, peace is a choice. You have to be willing to make it. And it's hard, and people have to make compromises that they don't like, but you can make that choice. And until both the Israelis and the Palestinians are willing to make that choice, as not your average person would make that choice, oh, I don't know, like yesterday, right? But until people are willing to make that choice, there will not be peace. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And yet, what are the challenges? What are the challenges for peace, certainly in the wake of the start of the war between Israel and Hamas? But, I mean, what are the challenges? Where do people live? What are you going to do with all those people that now live in the settlements? What are you going to do with people that are dispossessed? How are you going to bring peace to... The Gaza Strip has 2 million people living in 23 square kilometers. 42,000 Gazans are dead since the start of the conflict. 42,000. That does not minimize the 1,200 or more Jewish lives that were lost, but do the math. The land is not empty. With all due respect to people like Golda Meir, it's not a land of people without a land without people for people without a land. And that's why, and you know, Hamas has been saying, Hamas, like people were not paying attention. It's sort of like 73, sort of like the war in 1973. They were militarizing, they were doing exercises, and the Israelis ignored it. So that's how we got to today. And nobody asked me what is the answer? Because I think at some point people are going to have to choose it. That's what I think is the answer for peace. We're going to wake up. We're going to get rid of the people we're going to get rid of the current folks. too much animus, too much hatred, and we're gonna let the next generation take it. And they are my hope. So we have a few minutes for questions. And again, I apologize so much that the slideshow wasn't working.
Oh, this is wonderful.
Let's, well, you're thinking of your questions, because as I tell my students, I still have a few minutes of your time. I will tell you a little bit about the situation in Syria, but first, I'll say the Hail Mary for you in Arabic. Assalamu alayki ya Maryam. Maryam is Mary. Ya mumtalia ni ma'atan aruba ma'aki mubarakatan anti baina nisa wa mubarakan samratu patniki sadina ya sulamashi ya kadisa Maryam ya walidatala Sali Laijina Nahul Kata Al Ana Wafisaata Watina. Amin.
Amen.
Amen. Eid Milad Majid. Eid Milad Majid. Merry Christmas. Yes. So, really fast. Does anybody want to know about Syria?
Yes.
Okay. I can tell you a little bit. So, Bashar al-Assad, Assad, interestingly enough, means lion in Arabic. I know. I know. His father was even more of a monster, if you can imagine this. Bashar started life as an optometrist. Oh, I know, right? He was living in England. His brother Basil was the heir apparent to their father Hafez. And Basil died driving one of his sports cars too fast across the desert. And crashed it, and that was the end of Basil. But in the meantime, Bashar is living in London, married, very happy, just, like being an optometrist. And, yeah, right? So he's called back, and there was a lot of hope when he first arrived that he was going to be less of a monster than his father, it turns out. They're right in there together. So about 20 years ago, the Syrian Civil, 13 years ago, started, the Syrian Civil War started about 13 years ago, right? The rebel forces, and it looked like Bashar was safe. Recently, right, it's looked like he was safe. And then just a couple of days ago, the leader of the rebel group, a man named Jolani, that's his nom de guerre, managed to first take Aleppo, which is actually the largest city in Syria, and then march on Damascus, and Bashar al-Assad has fled. And what's interesting about Jolani, he's an interesting guy. His group, Mayat Tahrir al-Sham, Tahrir means freedom, started out as al-Nusra. And al-Nusra was like ISIS. And originally affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but then Al-Qaeda kind of rejected al-Nusra and said they were too violent. I know. So he's been, but what's interesting about Jolani is that he and his kind of rebel forces, they've been in the province of Idlib now all this time. He's in his early 40s. And he has shown some facility and some ability to govern, which is like ISIS, no. Are you kidding? They wanted territory, but if they got it, they wouldn't know what the hell to do with it. Right? Like, oh, now we've got to govern. They're kind of like the Taliban. Oh. Huh, now we have to govern. He has set up some administrative support. There's some healthcare. There's education for boys and girls. Yeah, really an interesting guy. And he contends that he wants to make Syria safe for everybody. He is Sunni, which is also interesting, because one of the reasons that Syria was supported by Iran was that the Alawites, which the Assad family are Alawites, they are an offshoot of Shiism. And we know that in Iran, the majority in Iran and Iraq is Shia. So, but Jolani is Sunni. So, he's probably going to have some tension with Iran and certainly with Hezbollah. Although Hezbollah, they're kind of like, whatever. Yeah, so that's the situation today. But he's like I said, he's really interesting. And where in the past Bashar was willing to stand and fight, he's not now. He left. He took his family and he left the country yesterday, leaving it to the rebels, which I find a really interesting choice. Where is he? Nobody seems to know. Yes, this is the optometrist, yes. He took his family and he left. So that is the situation in Syria today. All seems to be quiet between Israel and Hezbollah. In Lebanon, for now. So let's do questions.
Please tell me he's not coming to the United States.
Who? Oh, Bashar? Oh, hell no. I mean, his greatest ally is Russia. I don't think he's in Iran, but he might be. He might be in Russia. God willing, inshallah, he's not coming to the United States. No, we wouldn't. Yeah.
In the Israeli, Knesset,
Mm-hmm.
the members of that parliament, do they have to be Jewish?
No. No. But seats for non-Jewish citizens are limited so that they have no real power. Although the Arab List, which is the largest Palestinian party, they never have enough to be part of a coalition, but they do have enough support to shake up the elections. Do you see what I'm saying? So that they can cause difficulties, but they don't have enough power to be part of a governing coalition, at least not right now. Does that answer your question?
It does. I thought it was more inclusive than that, but it's somewhat inclusive.
It is.
Arabs there, but it's not wide open like, at least in this country, the way I understand it, we have the geographical regions, the person elected from that geographical region is your representative. But there, it must be different.
Well, the Arabs would have more power if they had not been moved out in 1948. So, yes, it's sort of geography, but there aren't enough of them to make a difference. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And the Christians, we're just doing our thing. We're just getting ready for Christmas. Oh, I'm sorry.
What's the percentage of Christians in Israel? Is there?
Oh my goodness, 5%?
Oh, 5% is all.
Maybe less. It could be less. 2% maybe? Used to be more, but many of them have left. The largest concentration of Christians, of course, is in parts of Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem. Yeah.
What is the general makeup of Hamas, age-wise?
Young. The makeup is young, like 40 and under, except for some of the top leaders. I think Yahya Sinwar, before he met his death, was in his 50s. But the majority of the rank and file, the leaders are older. The leaders are more like, in their 50s or 60s. But the rank and file, they're young. And mostly young men. And many of them young, educated men who can't get jobs.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah. So yeah. Yeah.
So my question originally was, so what was Hamas's end game? I mean, you're flying little things over the wall, and the Israelis have jets, and so what's your end game?
Their end game is to end the occupation of the Gaza Strip.
So I've since heard that their end game was to engage, so to get Iran engaged, so that to get the wider group engaged to deal with Israel, because it doesn't make any sense what they did.
No, On some level, it was like, I would say it was, I mean, not as, peace loving as Sadat, but the idea that we can get you, we can get to you. When Hamas first attacked, that was their, we can get to you, do not underestimate us. When they did.
Yeah, but, they underestimate the response.
I don't know that they did.
Also, now you've got 42,000 people
People
dead.
dead. I know. I am not saying it makes sense. I'm saying that I don't know. I don't think they anticipated 42,000 people. No. They knew Israel was going to respond. And on some level, if you talk to the people in Hamas, they will tell you that we wanted to show that we made a small incursion and the Israelis did what they always do, which was a not proportional response. They are monsters. We're trying to
Okay.
prove to you that they are the monsters that we know them to be.
Okay.
And that and therefore we want them out of Gaza. Now, they said, the rhetoric was that if Israel withdraws from the occupied territories, they will cease their activities and they will go back to governing, which they actually know how to do. They have hospitals and schools. I mean, they know how to do it. I mean, maybe not like us, but I mean, they know how it's done. So the rhetoric is that if there was peace, we would stop. If there was an end to the occupation, we would stop. If there was a lifting of the blockade on Gaza, we would stop.
Do you think they really would?
I don't know. I think that once Iran and and Hezbollah and some of these other groups got involved, it made it a lot harder. So, they should have stayed out, is what I'm saying.
And then if that would have happened, you really think Hamas would have just let it be?
I think, I don't know for sure. I think there's a possibility. But what would have had to happen is that Hamas and Al-Fatah, which is a Palestinian authority based in Ramallah, would have to get together and figure out how they're going to govern the West Bank and the Gaza Strip together. So Fatah would have had to accept a place for Hamas in the governing structure of the entire region that is Palestine. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
If it were up to me and my students, before he died, my students wanted to take Yahya Sinwar and Bibi Netanyahu and put them in a room and not let them out until they figured it out. Right? You have to stay there. You are on administrative detention, is one of my students said, until you figure this out. And if you could bring the full weight of the international community, and maybe this answers your question, if you could bring the full weight of the international community to bear on, we have to get it right this time, I think there was a chance. I think we just set ourselves back 10 years. But I have to believe, at some point you have to believe that they don't want their children dead either. Right?